Welcome to the Truth and Liberty Show, where trusted leaders bring biblical insights to important issues to help you stand for truth and effect godly change in our nation and in our world.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Truth and Liberty Show. I'm Richard Harris. Just really glad that you could be joining us for today's program. At the Congressional prayer breakfast, a few weeks ago, President Donald Trump made an amazing announcement that should excite believers across America. He said that on May the 17th of this year, there's going to be a celebration and a ceremony on the Mall in Washington, D.C., where we are going to rededicate America to God. It's called Rededicate 250. This year is the 250th anniversary of the United States, and I can't think of anything more appropriate than that we as a nation rededicate our country to God. Here's a picture of the website that the White House has set up. It says on the website, National Jubilee of Prayer, Praise, and Thanksgiving. Now, this is an extremely powerful idea. America needs to be reminded and called back to its godly heritage. At last year's Summer Family Bible Conference here at Andrew Womack Ministries, I shared a message called Vision for America. And in this, I talked about how the United States next year, which we're here now, it will be our 250th anniversary, and that's 5 sets of 50 years. In the Bible, Israel was commanded to celebrate what the Bible called a jubilee every 50 years. And it was a time set aside for restoration. Slaves would be set free, debts would be canceled, and people would be returned to their original inheritance as determined when they first came into the Promised Land. I believe there's powerful significance here. And in fact, for the White House to call this a jubilee is confirmation, because in my message I said that this jubilee year of the United States, this 5th jubilee, is actually tied directly into the fact that God has spoken to us and said that the Third Great Awakening has already begun. I believe these things are tied together. We need to rediscover our inheritance as a nation. America was founded by Christians on Christian principles and biblical ideals. The principles that America was founded on came straight out of the Bible. The people that came to America, they came here in order to build a society that glorified God and spread the Christian faith. Just look at the Mayflower Compact. The Mayflower Compact, the earliest settlers in New England were the Pilgrims. And they were called separatists from England. They were separatists because they wanted to separate from the Church of England so that they could practice their Protestant Christian faith according to the dictates of the Word of God and their conscience. And they sailed on a ship called the Mayflower across the ocean and landed at what we now call Cape Cod, Massachusetts in 1620. They wrote an agreement among themselves, and we call it now the Mayflower Compact, and it was about how they wanted to govern themselves. It reads in part, "We whose names are underwritten, having undertaken for the glory of God and the advancement of the Christian faith, we solemnly and mutually pledge to each other in the presence of God and one another, we covenant and combine ourselves together in a civil body politic. We form a government together in the presence of God. For what purpose now? To glorify Him and advance the Christian faith." You see, they were seeking to build this new society here in the New World, and every colony that followed had similar pronouncements in their charters. New England townships were essentially church congregations, Protestant church congregations, that would set up and move and build new communities. For example, Connecticut was founded by a preacher named Thomas Hooker. And Reverend Hooker, after he and his congregation settled in a new township, they called a meeting at the church to create a local government. Reverend Hooker preached a sermon, and afterwards the people wrote what is now called the Fundamental Orders of Connecticut, and they basically incorporated Pastor Hooker's sermon into the town constitution. And Reverend Hooker, he said, in this sermon of his, he said that the foundation of authority for government is laid firstly in the consent, the free consent of the people. Because of that idea, which at the time was revolutionary, He is now called the father of the American Constitution. As the United States Supreme Court Justice Earl Warren, he studied the history of America and the colonies, and in 1954 he said this. Earl Warren said, "I believe no one can read the history of our country without realizing that the good book and the spirit of the Savior have from the beginning been our guiding geniuses. Whether we look to the Charter of Virginia, or to the Charter of New England, or to the Charter of Massachusetts Bay, or to the Fundamental Orders of Connecticut, the same objective is present, a Christian land governed by Christian principles." Folks, it didn't just stop with the Pilgrims and the early colonists. Between 1730 and 1755, there was a massive revival that swept across America, and this has been now called by historians the First Great Awakening. The greatest preacher in the First Great Awakening was a man named George Whitefield. George Whitefield preached 1,800 sermons, outdoor messages mostly, up and down the colonies. He preached so often and crowds were so big that historians estimate that 80% of Americans alive at the time heard him preach in person. Even Benjamin Franklin, one of our preeminent founding fathers, heard him, and he said this: "The multitudes of all sects and denominations that attended the sermons were enormous." It was wonderful to see the change soon made in the manners of our inhabitants. From being thoughtless or indifferent about religion, it seemed as if all the world were growing religious. You couldn't walk through the towns in the evening without hearing psalms sung in different families of every street. Isn't that amazing? Benjamin Franklin said that about the First Great Awakening. The ideas that were preached in this awakening, they didn't just include how to get saved. They included the equality of man, direct access and accountability to God, also about God's purposes for government, His desire that men would be free, and more. And these ideas gave rise to the resistance against British tyranny, the American Revolution, and ultimately the Declaration of Independence itself. America was birthed out of revival, folks. The Declaration of Independence, our national birth certificate, we're going to be celebrating it this year. It is a distinctly Christian document. It refers to God 5 times, and every one of the references to God show a Christian theology, a Christian worldview. Thomas Jefferson wrote in the opening paragraph, he said, "When in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another, and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which," now listen, "the laws of nature and nature's God entitle them. A decent respect for the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to the separation." Now, this phrase, the laws of nature and nature's God, what is that? Well, history tells us it's a phrase that refers to the idea that there is an invisible and eternal and unchanging moral law that God has woven into His created universe, and that it's our obligation as created beings to discover that law and to conform our conduct and our life to that law. Natural law, as it has come to be known in short, was the foundation of American civil law for the first 150 years of our nation's existence, until this thing called secular humanism came along in the late 19th and early 20th centuries and threw the entire idea out in favor of the concept that, no, we get to make the law on our own. It gets to be whatever we say it is. The law is whatever the judge says it is. All kinds of poisonous and devilish philosophies have come out of that. But let's get back to the Declaration. It says the second reference of God is those famous words that Jefferson wrote where he said, "We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal and are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, among which are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." Jefferson's words reflect the biblical idea of the inherent worth and dignity of every individual, no matter their race, no matter their class, no matter their wealth, no matter their family name, no matter their political status. His words came right out of Genesis chapter 1, verse 26, where God stamped on every human being His own image. He said, "Let us make man in our own image and in our own likeness." The worth of each person is ultimately declared, brothers and sisters, by what? By the precious blood of Christ. As it says in John 3:16, "For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever believes in him would not perish but have everlasting life." You see, communism and Marxism and Islam and non-Christian ideologies, non-Judeo-Christian ideologies, they don't value individual life. No, individuals are expendable for the greater good, for the Marxist cause, for the Islamic agenda. But not so in Christianity, not so in America that's built on the Bible. Third, in the Declaration it says, "We appeal to the Supreme Judge of the universe for the rectitude of our intentions." What they're saying is, we believe that what we're doing is right, and we believe it with a sincere heart, and we trust God to be our judge. Even if we're wrong, our hearts are right. Well, this is a distinct Christian idea, that God is the judge of mankind and that he judges not just based on performance, but based on the conscience and the condition of the heart. Fourth, the founders said at the end of the document, they said, "With a firm reliance upon the protection of divine providence, we mutually pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor." This is covenant language, actually. There's a three-way covenant between the founders themselves and God. They brought God into this covenant called the Declaration of Independence, and they put their trust in him. Do you know a deist would never say such a thing as "I trust in divine providence"? Because deists believe, by definition, a deist believes God isn't involved in human affairs. The founders were aware that the principles they were fighting for came from the Word of God. John Adams, he was on the committee that drafted the Declaration. He was a signer of the Declaration. He was the second president of the United States. He was asked, what ideas did the founders rely on? And he said this, quote, "The general principles upon which the founders achieved independence were the general principles of Christianity." Now, I will avow then that I then believed and now believe that those general principles of Christianity are as eternal and immutable as the existence and attributes of God. And it wasn't just the Declaration either. It was the Constitution that came later, that was built on the Declaration, that followed these Christian biblical principles. There was a historian in 1928 who wrote a book called "The New England Clergy and the American Revolution." Her name was Alice Baldwin. She was at Duke University. She studied the First Great Awakening and the American Revolution, the Declaration and the Constitution, and she concluded this. She said, quote, "There is not a right asserted in the Declaration of Independence which had not been discussed by the New England clergy before 1763. The Constitutional Convention and the Constitution were the children of the pulpit." Donald Lutz, a professor at the University of Houston, did a study in the late 1960s and early 70s that took 10 years, where he studied 15,000 original writings of the Founding Fathers in America. He wanted to know the answer to this question. He wanted to know, what did they rely on? Where were they drawing their inspiration? The answer from his study was unequivocal. In The Origins of American Constitutionalism, Professor Lutz demonstrated that of all the quotations in the Founding Fathers' writings, 34% of them came from the Holy Bible. That was 4 times as many as the second place finisher, Charles de Montesquieu, a French philosopher. The founders quoted him only 8% of the time. Every other source went down from there. The Bible was by far and away the winner, the number one source that our founders relied on. I think President Ronald Reagan summed this up so well. In 1983, when he declared it to be the year of the Bible, he said this: "Of the many influences that have shaped the United States of America into a distinctive nation and people," this gets me, guys, none may be said to be more fundamental and enduring than the Bible. The Bible and its teachings help form the Founding Fathers' abiding belief in the inalienable rights of the individual, rights which they found implicit in the Bible's teaching, so of the inherent worth and dignity of the individual. Can you see, brothers and sisters, how America is a uniquely Christian nation, how our founding and our principles were built on the gospel of Jesus Christ? Today, On our show, we're going to have a chance to chat with a homeschool father and his attorney, James Woolard, and his attorney from First Liberty Institute. James is suing the state of California over his rights to the free exercise of his religious beliefs. California established a public program where parents could get state funding for all kinds of educational options outside of public schools, including private school and homeschooling. However, they said, the one thing you cannot do, you can't use this money for religious material. Well, James, he wanted to buy some curriculum from Christian sources. And they said, no, you can't do that. Another one of their clients, they wouldn't even let her write the word God on one of her quizzes and tests or reports. Another one of their clients got expelled from this same charter school where they were trying to facilitate this program. You know, our founding fathers would have never supported this kind of discrimination against Christianity. They understood that Christianity was the foundation of our freedom and that government should encourage it and facilitate it. Although the First Amendment says government cannot establish religion, that phrase in its historical context is clear. It's talking about the creation of a single national established church, which was common in Europe at the time. Our history is filled with examples of where the leaders in our country seamlessly encouraged and facilitated Christianity, and no one thought that it was a violation of the First Amendment. For example, the Continental Congress. These are the same guys that wrote the First Amendment. The Continental Congress actually spent federal money during the Revolution to purchase Bibles, and they did it twice. The first one is a really moving account. After the Revolutionary War began, there was a shortage of Bibles in America because before the independence, the British monopolized the printing of Bibles in English. So you couldn't print them in the colonies. And then after the war, there was an embargo, so we couldn't, it was difficult, we couldn't import them from England either. So Congress was meeting in Philadelphia at Independence Hall during the Battle of Brandywine Creek, which was only 25 miles away. They could hear the cannons being fired. They could hear the musket fire. They knew that the British were close and that they needed to evacuate. They knew that if the Americans didn't prevail in the battle, Philadelphia was going to be captured. What do you think they spent their time doing at that last session before Philadelphia fell to the British? You would have thought it'd be something urgent, something important. Well, it was something urgent. It was something important. They passed a resolution at the last minute to spend federal money on the importation of 20,000 English Bibles from Holland. At a different point, the Continental Congress actually commissioned again an actual printing of the Bible in America in English with government money. This was called the Aitken Bible, became known as the Bible of the Revolution. And in the preface to this Bible, it says that this is a neat edition of the Holy Scriptures for use in schools. Speaking of education, during America's founding era, the Bible was commonly used in schools. Not only that, children were taught Bible stories, Bible lessons, and had required scripture memorization. The most common textbook of the time was this book called, a little tiny book called the New England Primer, which is filled from front to back of Bible verses, Bible references, and Bible stories. This is how children learn to read. Until the 1960s in America, Bible reading and prayer and memorization of the Ten Commandments in public schools was commonplace, as you can see from this picture. Benjamin Rush, one of our founding fathers who signed the Declaration and is deemed by many to be one of the three most influential founding fathers, was an advocate for using the Bible as the primary textbook in schools. He said this: if we were to remove the Bible from public schools, we would be wasting so much time punishing crimes and taking so little pains to prevent them. He said, the only means of establishing and perpetuating our Republican form of government is the universal education of our youth in the principles of Christianity by means of the Bible. Here's another example. George Washington, the father of our country, the commander-in-chief of the Continental Army, during the American Revolution, he petitioned Congress for money to pay chaplains to be in every brigade of the Continental Army, a petition which they granted. And in the winter of 1778, in the most extreme and dire conditions at Valley Forge, What will you think Washington was doing? Well, he was doing everything he could to hold the army together. But one of the things he did, which stands out, is he issued orders requiring that divine services, or basically church services, be held every Sunday, and that the officers in the army attend those services. I think it's important to read Washington's own words. It says this: "The commander-in-chief directs that divine services be performed every Sunday at 11 o'clock in each brigade which has a chaplain. Those brigades which have none shall attend the places of worship nearest to them." He said, "It is the expectation that officers of all ranks will, by their attendance, set an example for their men. While we zealously perform the duties of good citizens and soldiers, we certainly ought not to be inattentive to the higher duties of religion." To the distinguished character of a patriot, listen, church, it should be our highest duty to give glory and to laud the more distinguished character of a Christian. The signal instances of providential goodness which have crowned our labors. Here he is in Valley Forge suffering, and he's giving glory to God for protection and provision. And he says, "With complete success, demand from us in a peculiar manner the warmest returns of gratitude and piety to the supreme author of all good." Yeah, that was a deist, George Washington, sure. One of the clearest proofs of the Founding Fathers' mindset on the relationship between our Christian faith and government is seen in the incredible number of official proclamations which the Founding Fathers issued, calling the American people to pray and to fast and to humble themselves and repent of sins. They did this in times of danger and in times of victory and blessing. In the founding era from 1760 to 1814, the national and local governments in America issued more than 1,400 official proclamations, just like this one you see issued by John Hancock, the governor of Massachusetts, calling the people to prayer and fasting. America has always been referred to as a Christian nation. Both our, not only our presidents, but our Congress and our courts have continuously acknowledged this fact. Here's a few examples. Lyndon Johnson, not the godliest man, but Lyndon Johnson said, "In the last 200 years, we have guided the building of our nation and our society by the principles and precepts brought to earth nearly 2,000 years ago by that first Christmas." Richard Nixon said, "Let us remember that as a Christian nation, we have a charge and we have a destiny." Herbert Hoover said, American life is builded and can survive only upon the fundamental philosophy announced by the Savior 19 centuries ago. Harry Truman, "This is a Christian nation. In this great country of ours, it has been demonstrated the fundamental unity of Christianity and democracy." Well, even the United States Supreme Court, John Jay, the first Chief Justice, he said this: "Providence has given to our people the choice of their rulers, and it is their duty as well as their privilege to prefer Christians for their rulers." Joseph Story, one of the great jurists in our history, wrote this. He said, "There never has been a period in which the common law did not recognize Christianity as lying at its foundations. There would be seen a peculiar propriety in viewing the Christian religion as the greatest basis on which it must depend for its support and permanence." And on I could go. John McLean on the Supreme Court from 1830 to 1861 said, "For many years, my hope for the perpetuity of our institutions has rested upon Bible morality and the general dissemination of Christian principles. Our mission of freedom is not carried out by brute force, by canon law or any other law except the oral law and those Christian principles which are found in the Scriptures." And in an important case called Vidal versus Girard's Executors, 1844. Now, this case, what happened was there was an atheist, a Frenchman living in America who was really wealthy, and he left in his will a bunch of money to build a school for orphans in Philadelphia. But he said no minister should ever be allowed to teach in this school. Well, the heirs of Girard filed a lawsuit saying this is not a provision that can be enforced in America. And the United States Supreme Court agreed with them. Again, Justice Joseph Story, he wrote this. He said, probably at the time of the adoption of the Constitution and of the amendments to it, the general, if not the universal sentiment in America was that Christianity ought to receive encouragement from the state, so far as it is not incompatible with the private rights of conscience and the freedom of religious worship. That's powerful. We need to remember his words today. You know, and it wasn't just the presidents and it wasn't just the courts, Congress too. In the 1840s and 50s, there was a movement that began rising out of Darwinism and the French Revolution, the spread of atheism, that said, hey, this Constitution of yours, this requires strict separation. It requires total, separation, secularism. And Congress held hearings on a petition that these atheists put forward in both the House and the Senate to say, is this true? Is this a proper interpretation of the Constitution of the First Amendment? And here's what the House Judiciary Committee concluded. They said, had the people during the Revolution any suspicion of any attempt to war against Christianity, that revolution would have been strangled in its cradle. At the time of the adoption of the Constitution and the amendments, the universal sentiment was that Christianity should be encouraged, not any one sect or denomination. In this age, there can be no substitute for Christianity. In its general principles, it is the great conservative element on which we must rely for the permanence of free institutions. Do you see it, guys? Our founders understood that freedom and republicanism depend upon Christianity, and there's nothing wrong. In fact, it is necessary for the state to be an encourager and a facilitator of general principles of Christianity. The U.S. Senate Judiciary Committee reached the same conclusion. So how is it then that today we have throughout the land bought into the idea that we're violating the law when the government encourages Christianity, encourages church attendance or the Ten Commandments? And I'm going to tell you it's because of this concept called secularism, radical secularism. It's an ideology that first began in the late 1800s, and it was built on the back of atheistic Darwinian evolution. It's the idea that God and religion has no place in public life at all. Government and all public life must be, quote unquote, secular. Religion, after all, is an intellectual weakness, and it's really just a private matter. This was not what America was built on, and it is not a proper understanding of either Scripture or the First Amendment. The First Amendment was not meant to secularize the government. It was meant to preserve religious freedom. It says Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. The Establishment Clause in there, in its historical context, meant that Congress can't set up a national church, especially one of a particular denomination like they had in Europe. This is what our founders fled from in Europe. And it's what led to religious wars and to persecutions of people and restrictions on religious freedom. But what has happened through radical secularism is the First Amendment has been turned on its head. Now it is the weapon of anti-God atheists to restrict religious belief and religious expression. Exactly the opposite of what the founders intended. But I have good news for you today. Great progress is being made in restoring the historical proper understanding of the First Amendment. The Supreme Court of the United States has recognized now that radical secularism has resulted in unconstitutional discrimination against religious expression in public life, and that something is out of balance, something is wrong. There was a case called Lemon versus Kurtzman back in 1971, where the U.S. Supreme Court said, we can tolerate no breach of the wall of separation of church and state It goes back further than this, actually, to 1947, but I don't have time to go into all of it. But in Lemon v. Kurtzman, the court said there's a three-factor test, and the public action, the government action can't endorse religion, it can't substantially advance religion, and it has to stay strictly neutral between religion and what they called irreligion. Of course, that's a farce, right? There's no way to be neutral. If you're not supporting religion, you're opposing religion. In a series of cases, though, in the last few years, this doctrine, the Lemon versus Kurtzman case, was actually overturned. In Kennedy versus Bremerton School District, Coach Joe Kennedy, a coach for the high school football team in Bremerton, Washington, dared to pray on the 50-yard line after football games. He went out and knelt in the middle of the field and gave thanks to God for keeping his players safe, for helping them play well, and show good sportsmanship and things of this line along these lines. After a while, the players started to join him on the field, and then players from other teams started to join him, and that was too much for the leftists. They started to complain. The school district said, "You can't do that. Separation of church and state." He said, "But I told God I would. I'm not stopping." They fired him. He took his case all the way to the Supreme Court. And in Kennedy versus Bremerton School District, the United States Supreme Court said, "You know what? This case of Lemon versus Kurtzman, it's no longer good law. It wasn't well decided. It's resulted in so many problems and so many extreme rulings. This can't be the intent of the founders." From now on, we're going to look at history. We're going to look at what has been historically acceptable to the American people, not just what liberal progressives want today. And by overturning Lemon, they have opened the door for more religious freedom in America than we've had in 60 years. In another case, Trinity Lutheran versus Comer. In that case, there was a government program that said, "We'll help you with children's programs. We'll give you funding." Well, Trinity Lutheran Church in Missouri said, "Well, we want to redo the playground on our church." And the government said, "No, we can't help you. You're a church after all." And the church said, "Well, why not? You help everybody else. Why are we bad?" And they took it to the Supreme Court, and the court said, "You know what? The church is right here. A state cannot deny funding for a generally publicly available program that is not religious in nature just because it is going to a church. That's unlawful discrimination." In another case, in American Legion versus American Humanist Association, a town in Maryland had a cemetery. Well, originally that cemetery was privately owned, first of all, but they had built this massive cross after World War I to honor the dead that were killed in World War I. Eventually, the city acquired the land, and the secularists, the humanists, began to sue. And they said, "You can't have that cross anymore because this is government property." Well, the city said, "Not so fast." And they took the case all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court, and the court said, "You know what? The city can keep the cross. This has been traditionally acceptable to Americans for generations and generations. And your reading of the First Amendment, American Humanist Association, it's too radical and it's off base." And then in Shirtfield, the city of Boston, another case, there was a Christian camp, and the city of Boston has a flagpole outside City Hall. And they would fly flags for any group whatsoever. It didn't matter what it was, unless it was Christian. Well, this camp said, "We want to fly our flag. It's the Christian flag." And the city of Boston said, "No, we can't allow Christianity on public property." And they sued. And this one also went all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court in 2023. And in that case, the court said again, you cannot discriminate like that against Christianity. It has a place in the public square. Christians can express their faith and are entitled to all the privileges of citizenship just like anybody else in the expression of their faith. Our guests today are taking their case all the way to the Supreme Court if necessary. And it's a great example of where the battle lines now are in our quest to restore the proper interpretation of freedom of religion and the freedom of religion clauses in the First Amendment. A victory will mean a great deal for the cause of freedom in America today. And so I'm really looking forward to sharing with you this interview with Kayla Toney, who's an attorney with First Liberty Institute, founded by Kelly Shackelford. Ms. Toney is an expert on First Amendment issues. She represents clients of all faiths, especially in educational context. And she serves as amicus coordinator for all First Liberty appellate and Supreme Court cases. Before joining First Liberty, Kayla highlighted religious freedom cases as a constitutional law fellow for the Beckett Fund for Religious Liberty. And she's also served for the United States Court of Appeals for the Armed Forces and in many other capacities. And Kayla earned her law degree from George Washington University and served as president of the Federalist Society chapter there and has done other things. So we're very glad to have her on the show today, along with John Woolard, her client, who is standing strong for religious freedom for all of us. So I'm looking forward to this interview. We're going to share some information with you now in a short break. But before we go, I wanted to tell you about this little booklet that I'm offering today for free. This is my booklet called The Calling to Manhood. A few years ago, God laid it on my heart to minister at the Summer Family Bible Conference here on the subject of manhood. You know, I believe that the devil has been lying to us. He's been telling women, you got to be more like men, and men, you should be ashamed of being a man. You should be more like women, and there's no difference, and yet you've got to be like the other. And everybody gets so confused, they don't know who they are. But the truth is, the Bible says, act like men. And it has a unique calling, God does. He made us male and female. And He's got a calling on men and a calling on women. And we need to rediscover what that calling is. Well, in this booklet, I talk about how biblically God has called men to lead and to work and to fight for freedom and truth and for the things they love. Get a copy of it today by going to our website. And I hope that this is an inspiration to you and a blessing. So, guys, stay tuned. We'll be right back with this amazing interview that you won't want to miss.
Now more than ever, America needs men of steadfast faith, men who lead with courage, guard truth, and protect freedom, even in seasons of loss. The Calling to Manhood by Richard Harris is a guide to living that God-given purpose. When the world feels shaken, let this be your call to stand strong for your family, your community, and our nation. Rise up, stay faithful, and make a difference. Order your copy today.
All right, everybody, welcome back to Truth and Liberty. And our guests today, we have two. John Woolard is joining us, along with his attorney, Kayla Toney from First Liberty Institute. And folks, I'm really thankful for you joining the program today. Thanks for coming on.
Thank you for having us.
All right. Well, let's begin with you, John. So I've already told the audience a little bit about your case, but I understand that California has a program where they allow tax dollars, state money, to help families with education options outside of the normal public schools, so private schools, homeschooling, and so forth. And you are a homeschool family, and you guys wanted to use that money to purchase some curriculum, and you got denied. The state said, nope, you can't do that. Can you tell us more about that and what happened?
Yeah, so we started homeschooling our kids several years ago. I have 5 children. And this looked like a really good option for us. We were deeply vested in educating our kids, consistent with our religious convictions. And so we joined one of the charter schools that are here. And I don't want to throw off your audience by using the term charter school, because they might think that that's a brick and mortar school that we go to. But really, the charter school is kind of like an administrative hub that allows for us to use these state funds to purchase curriculum of our choice. And then we perform the instruction in our home. So we ran up against some obstacles almost immediately when we wanted to purchase curriculum from different producers who had religious convictions spread throughout the curriculum. So if we wanted to buy a science curriculum that mentioned God or mentioned creation, we would be denied. If we wanted to get history curriculum that mentioned like the faith of pre-colonial Americans, we would be denied.
Wow.
And we kind of just took it as like, this is the way that the charter school is going to run. It wasn't immediately clear to me that what they were doing was wrong or unconstitutional, but that's kind of our initial experience of it.
Well, and so you were not allowed to buy Christian curriculum for your homeschool, is that right?
Correct. So we choose the curriculum, whatever suits our needs, whatever we think is going to best educate our children. and then we send the request over to the school, and the school will either pass it along and send the curriculum back to us, or they'll deny it for whatever reason. Now, normally the denials are going to be this doesn't meet state standards or something like that. But in this case, the denials that we were getting for our curriculum only reflected the religious persuasion of the curriculum itself. And after several clarifying emails where I asked, is there a problem that this curriculum isn't meeting state standards? Well, no, that's not the problem. Is there a problem that this isn't at grade level or for the competency of my children? No, that's not the problem. So then I asked just very baldly, so you're saying that the only problem with this curriculum is that it infuses faith with education? That's literally the only problem. And they were very clear, like, yes, that's the only problem.
Wow. So Kayla, you have filed a lawsuit on behalf of John and some other homeschool families. Can you tell us more about the case?
Yes, absolutely. We are so glad to represent the Woolard family as well as two other homeschool families in California. And we filed a federal lawsuit because, as John alluded to, this is unconstitutional discrimination. The First Amendment guarantees the right of parents to direct the religious upbringing of their children, and also that the state won't interfere with the free exercise of religion. And so for these families and for thousands of others like them in California and in other states with similar school choice programs, raising their own children according to their faith in their own homes is really at the core of their beliefs. And for the government to not only deny funding if that's used for a religious purpose, but then to not even accept the worksheets of these kids. So even when the families use their own money to buy, Bob Jones or Rebecca or other religious-based curriculum from religious publishers, the programs will reject the worksheets that the children fill out and say those don't count for credit. Those don't count toward your graduation. And so, that's discrimination as well. So that's why we sued. We brought free exercise and free speech claims because there's a element here where the children's speech is actually being shut down. John's children should be able to write on a worksheet, God is love, or God sends the rain to make the plants grow. That was one of the lines that was rejected specifically.
Oh my goodness.
Because it referenced God on a grammar worksheet of all things. And so we brought those free exercise and free speech claims in federal court in California. We received a disappointing decision at the lower court, and so we immediately appealed up to the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals. And the Ninth Circuit has a lot of influence because it covers really all the western states of the U.S., not just California. And so we had a 3-judge panel that considered the case last summer, and they unfortunately ruled against us as well. And the reasoning was very thin in the opinion. They essentially just said these are traditional public schools and public schools don't have to teach religion, which is really preposterous when you hear John explain that he and his wife teach their children in their own homes. That's about as far from a traditional public school as you could possibly get.
Yeah.
And so we did something called a petition for rehearing en banc, which is a fancy legal way of saying we appealed the decision. We said we didn't like that. Please try again. And we asked the full Ninth Circuit to rehear the case. And so essentially we're saying these 3 judges got it wrong. We want 11 judges to hear the case again. And we're still waiting on that decision to find out whether they will rehear the case, but we're hopeful that they might. And if not, we will probably have to seek review from the Supreme Court. And the good news here is that we know the Supreme Court cares deeply about this issue. They've actually ruled 3 times in similar cases that once the state decides to open up a school choice program, they cannot discriminate against religious families. So we think the precedent on that is very strong.
Well, Kayla, thank you for that. Can you help our audience a little bit here? Because, we've heard this phrase separation of church and state for so long. And, kids aren't allowed to pray in school. They're not allowed to read the Bible in school. We can't have God in schools. That we're so steeped in it now. But things have begun changing in this arena over the last few years as far as Supreme Court precedent goes. Why do you believe that what California has done in refusing to let anybody mention even God is a violation of the Constitution?
Well, the founders specifically protected religion in the very First Amendment, and they actually gave it double protection because you've got the free exercise clause and the free speech clause, and they work together to protect the religious speech that's going on here when parents are teaching their own kids. And you mentioned favorable Supreme Court cases. I'll just throw out 2. Carson v. Macon was an amazing First Liberty case that we were so thankful to be part of. And that is one that was about a school choice program in Maine, where religious families were told you can choose any school you want as long as it's not religious. And so that really defeated the purpose of the school choice program. And the court said there very emphatically that you cannot discriminate based on the religious status of the school or a religious use that the parents might decide to choose for their kids. So I think Carson is very helpful here. And then the other case I'll mention is Mahmoud v. Taylor. This was just last year when the Supreme Court really upheld that right of parents to direct their own children's religious upbringing without government interference. And we think that right is the strongest when the parents are teaching their own kids at their own kitchen tables. And the state really should not be able to interfere with that.
Yeah, absolutely. And, the state in your case is going farther. It's not just, we can't spend state money on religious education. You can't even mention God in your schoolwork. That's a whole other level, isn't it?
It is, yes, absolutely. And that's why we brought the free speech and the free exercise claims, because we think they're both very important. And even in traditional public schools, students can learn about religion, they can express their own faith. The US Department of Education just last week put out some really helpful guidelines that explain how that Mahmoud case works, as well as some other important cases from the Supreme Court in recent years. And really the message is clear that faith has a welcome place in the public square. It's a very important part of the American experience, and that doesn't go away just because you bring in education. And certainly if we're talking about these alternative educational opportunities like homeschooling or private schools, faith is the whole reason why these families are undergoing the costs and effort of homeschooling. And so faith should be protected and not punished.
Well, John, let me ask you this. When you got these rulings, how did this make you and your wife and your family feel? Did you feel like that the state is hostile to your religious convictions, to your Christian faith?
Absolutely. When we first got pushback from the school with respect to our curriculum choices, we kind of just let it blow over. I mean, this was back in 2017 when I first became aware that what they were doing was probably unconstitutional and wrong and immoral. But the Lutheran Trinity versus Missouri case had come out, and I felt like my situation was very similar to what this school is experiencing, which was basically a publicly available benefit was being denied to a religious institution just because they were a religious institution. So in 2017, I reached out to a bunch of law groups that kind of support these sorts of cases, and everybody felt a little shy about taking up my case. They all acknowledged that my grievances were legitimate, but none of them felt like it was the right time. So then when the Carson v. Macon case came out, I thought, oh my goodness, this is exactly what I'm experiencing here in California. So I did a few things right away. First, I wrote to my charter school and I said, hey, this case was just released by the Supreme Court. I think that you all need to change course because you're illegally and unconstitutionally discriminating against me and my family. And the next thing I did is I reached out to a bunch of law firms and asked, hey, is anybody interested in supporting us? And First Liberty was kind enough to respond and say, yes, they want to support. So that was very encouraging. But then the decisions that have been laid down since then, they have been discouraging because I want to see justice brought about quickly. Justice delayed is justice denied. And my children are getting older. So, our ability to benefit from these decisions diminishes over time. But one thing I've realized is that this decision is not just about me and my family. This is about thousands of families all across California and across the United States who are going to be affected by the decision, whether that's to restrict religious exercise in this country or to really be the country we claim to be, which is where people are free to live out their convictions. And that's not just my convictions. It's the Muslim family that lives down the street. It's the Hindu family that lives down the street. I want them to be able to raise their children and raise their families in a way that's consistent with their convictions. So it's not just about me. It's about all the families in the society in which we live. And I'm prayerful and hopeful that we're going to get a decision that confirms what the Supreme Court's already said many times over.
Wow, John, thank you so much. I'm listening to your answer and I'm thinking to myself, oh my gosh, if all Christians could be as vigilant over their rights as you have been, watching Supreme Court precedent and comparing it to the facts of your case, that's just mind-boggling. Kayla, this is not on my script here, but isn't it wonderful having a client like that?
Yes, absolutely. John is an amazing client, and it's such a joy to get to represent these families. And really, as he said, it's never been about them. Of course, we want justice for them and for their own kids, but we just love that commitment to have that vision for all American families, that no one should be punished or treated like a second-class citizen because of their religious faith. If anything, religious faith gets special protection because that's the way that our founders envisioned this country. So yeah, such a pleasure to get to work on this case.
Well, and so you're saying that this case is really similar to Carson versus Macon out of Maine, where the state had a program that would pay tuition at private schools or whatever, and they refused to pay for anything that was pay for a Christian private school. Were those the facts of that case, basically?
Yes, that's correct. And Maine used as their excuse an amendment to their state constitution, which is called the Blaine Amendment. And the reason that's important is that there was a very discriminatory senator back in the 1890s who really hated immigrants, and he didn't want any outside influence. He didn't want any other faiths, especially Catholicism, to have any sort of impact. Some of his statements were terrible in terms of the hostility toward Catholics. And so a lot of states, including Maine and California, during that era of this kind of nativist idea that we couldn't allow, diverse religions, they passed these no aid provisions in their constitution, which basically say that no public money ever can go to any religious use. Well, the Supreme Court now 3 times has said that those are unconstitutional. That was the Trinity Lutheran case that John mentioned that sort of first inspired him to pursue legal action. And then Espinoza was a case out of Montana with the exact same issue in the school context, and then Maine. So the Supreme Court has already said 3 times these provisions are unconstitutional, but California is actually still relying on its Blaine Amendment in its constitution, saying, well, even if we wanted to fund these religious books, we can't because our constitution prevents it. And so we know that if the Supreme Court takes this case, they will say the exact same thing they've already said, but we're just hoping that the Ninth Circuit gets to that same conclusion sooner.
Yeah, absolutely. We're headquartered here in Colorado, and we've got the Blaine Amendment too, so we need to look for a case to get that off the books as well here, Kayla. But there's a case called Locke versus Davey where a state refused to pay for expenses for a religious degree, and the court there held that that was okay, that wasn't discriminatory against religion. How do you view that case, Kayla? Is that an obstacle for you, or is that easily distinguished, as we lawyers would say?
Yes, we think it's easily distinguished. We actually think it's effectively been overruled by that trio of recent cases I mentioned. They might not have said in as many words that it's completely overruled, but the principle is certainly clear. One of the phrases coming out of the Locke v. Davey case is called play in the joints, which is just kind of a strange legal way of referring to some sort of imaginary space between the Establishment Clause and the Free Exercise Clause. So the court's idea in that case, which really didn't get much traction, honestly, was that, well, the Establishment Clause might allow funding in this particular circumstance, but under the Free Exercise Clause, it's not required. So it's okay for the state to be a bully here and deny the religious funding. And I think what the court has made clear in the more recent cases is that there really isn't any play in the joints here. And in John's situation, the Establishment Clause really doesn't enter into it because he's not the state. He's a private individual teaching his own children. And so the fact that some state money would eventually make it into, his school library in his living room is really not, that's really not the state establishing religion at all. But what does come into play very much is John's free exercise of religion. And so for the state to deny this to him and then to punish his kids and not give them credit for their worksheet samples, that's actually violating his free exercise. And so I think John's case and other cases like it really illustrate that point, that we should be less concerned about some imaginary space between these clauses, and we should actually look at the First Amendment as a cord of 3 strands that are all tied together. So the Establishment Establishment Clause, the Free Exercise Clause, and the Free Speech Clause work together to provide very robust protection for religious families like the Woolards.
And real quick, Kayla, if you can comment on this. You mentioned Mahmoud v. Taylor, but this is also about parents' rights and who has primary responsibility for the education of their children. Now, Mahmoud dealt with religious instruction, but it's a little bit bigger than that, isn't it? Parents are the primary custodians of the children and should have control over their education. Is that right?
Yes, absolutely. And the Supreme Court has made that abundantly clear in the Mahmoud case. Now, that case was in a traditional public school setting. And the court said that parents' rights are so strong that they should be able to opt out of any teaching that substantially interferes with their religious beliefs. So the specific facts of that case related to books about pride that were being taught to elementary school students. But the court's opinion was very broad in the sense that it said any teaching that substantially interferes, those parents need to know in advance and they need to be able to opt out. And that was in a traditional public school setting. So I think in some ways our case is easier because this is in John's own home. It's not a traditional public school setting with government employees. And so he should be able to teach his faith absolutely to his own children. And that right, it doesn't just go back to Mahmoud, it actually goes back more than 100 years. The Supreme Court had some great decisions back in the 1920s explaining that parents get to choose where their kids go to school. They can't be forced to do public school. Those cases related to the Amish, some Catholic families that wanted to choose alternatives. And so those principles really go back more than 100 years.
Well, let's wrap this up, John, real quick. We're out of time, but let me just ask you this. What do you hope to accomplish by taking this stand? Is it about more than just you and your family?
Absolutely. So, as I mentioned just a moment ago, this absolutely is about more than just my family. It's about families all across the country, and it's about what kind of society do we want to live in? What kind of community of people do we want to feel welcomed and tolerated, true tolerance? And my hope and my prayer is that we can effectuate deep and lasting change that benefits and blesses all families across America, regardless of what their religious convictions are.
All right. And real quick, Kayla, what will it mean for religious liberty in America if the Supreme Court weighs in and rules in your favor?
That will be a significant victory. It'll show, as we've seen, just that we have more religious freedom now than ever before because of really positive decisions that go back to the founders' vision. I think the founders envisioned a country where religious pluralism would thrive and religious families would be free to raise their own kids according to their faith. And so a win from the Ninth Circuit or the Supreme Court in this case would go a long way toward making that vision that the founders had into a reality.
Excellent. Well, thank you guys so much for coming on Truth and Liberty. It's been a real treat, and we are praying for you guys and for victory and justice in this matter. Thank you for coming on.
Thank you.
And folks, if you're watching today, remember our free product offer. Just go to our website and pick up a copy of my booklet, The Calling to Manhood, today. This makes a great gift for any men in your life, as well as ladies. You need this too, to understand that God has designed us all, male and female, and each sex is designed for a purpose. Men, you're called to lead, to fight, and to work. So let's do this. All right. Thank you guys for coming on today. God bless you. We'll catch you all next time, all our viewers next time here on Truth and Liberty.